So today I'm here interviewing Bryan about community savings pools and how this concept works, and maybe a little bit about how it got started. I came to New Zealand and found out about it. It's only here in New Zealand, and I thought it's such a great idea. I wanted to participate in it, and I wanted to meet the guy who started it. So I arranged for Bryan and I to meet, and here we are in Auckland. And Bryan, I'm so happy to have this opportunity for you to tell the world a little bit about these community savings pools, this idea that you've come up with. So
sure.
Go ahead, let us have it.
Well, I was approached by two Maori women who are from a family group that was concerned about the quality of housing that their families enjoyed, and it's a pretty abysmal housing. They didn't have any access to finance for development on their community-owned land, and this is a common problem because banks require collateral, and that means that they can take the land away if you don't pay up. And so I knew that there are simple permaculture solutions to affordable housing, and that also that there are ways of financing things that don't entail borrowing money from banks. I had been privileged to meet a woman called Eva Stenius from the Sweden's JAK Bank, which is an interest-free bank. I didn't get to hear her talking, but I did get to hear that she'd made an offer to host anyone from New Zealand who was interested in starting up such an organisation here. And so when I talked about the idea with the family concerned, it seemed like a goer. They said, yep, we're interested. And so Joe and I raised some money. We got some contributions from other people, and we put in our own little bit and went off to Sweden. And the Swedish bank hosted us for several weeks, taking us through all their processes, meeting all their staff. They put us up in a bank apartment. We met the board members. We saw what pitfalls they'd encountered and how they'd overcome them. We were hosted by their strategic manager, and spent hours and hours just poring over this. And it was quite clear right from the outset actually that setting up a bank in New Zealand is just not a goer, because it takes at least $35 million in New Zealand to set up a bank as equity funding. And so I just had this idea that, well, okay, let's turn the bank upside down. After all, what's a bank doing? A bank is simply aggregating the money of its depositors. At one level, it's aggregating money of depositors and then making all the decisions about what it's going to do with that. And that's sort of one interpretation of banking, which I'm aware is not true, but for most people that's the case. So what happens if we look at the origin of the Rabobank in New Zealand, which is a Dutch bank that's come out of the farmers' cooperative movement. There used to be, I think, about 1,000 village financial cooperatives of farmers, because the merchant banks wouldn't fund the farming sector in Holland, and they simply did it themselves and aggregated their money, and it happened. And now they're a huge international bank, and those same farmers still own the bank, but the bank is like a modern corporate bank in its face, but actually it's a cooperative. So I thought, well, okay, why can't we go back to those village foundations and let a community pool its resources and make its decisions about how they're used. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and as long as everybody's in agreement, then it's perfectly legal. There's no legislation which prohibits agreements. It's in fact the fundamental to contract law. So I simply turned everything upside down and invested it in a set of agreements which any community of people can sign up to, and that creates the system.
I want to go back now because we're talking about going overseas, and you came back and you turned it on its head and you said, let's do it a little differently. And then what?
Oh, then I presented that to the head of the family that had originally presented with the housing problem. It was an old couple, they were in their 70s, and they'd had a house fire and not covered by insurance, and because they owned land, they fell outside the category that the New Zealand Housing Corporation would lend to, and because it was collectively owned land, it was not available as collateral, so the banks wouldn't touch it, and so we had no access to finance.
Wow.
And they had been several years trying to house themselves, and it was difficult. So I said, well, here's a way of doing it, and this is what you can do.
So you had a real case, a real example, example to use this
That's right
away.
Absolutely, yes.
And what year was this?
That was the impetus to go to Sweden to solve that problem.
I see. And what year was that you did that? Do you remember?
I think it was 2007.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you came back to the people and said, let's try this. And how'd it go?
Well, I was confident that it would work. I didn't couch it as try.
All right.
I couched it as this is what we need to do if we're going to solve this problem.
Right.
And it was also nested within the fact that it was a family group and it was housing. And if you've got a family group, you can call on the resources of your extended family. So in their case, they had cousins who did things like make floors for new houses, concrete floors, laid concrete. Other relatives who did electrical work. They had brothers who could do building work. And so there was a whole, and obligations that could be called on. Like they had interests in small forest plots, and so they were able to exchange standing trees for sawn timber and things that, until they got into this process, they saw themselves as just the poor of the poor. Then they discovered that actually they had a huge amount of resources, and it was beautiful to watch because you could feel and see people pride in themselves arising, that they actually weren't just nobodies in the bottom of the heap at all. And so they just got on with it, and they got on with it. They didn't wait to accumulate a whole lot of cash between themselves. They didn't start off with a nest egg, and they didn't wait. They just got on with it as money came together. And so, when you commit to anything, resources come to you. That's just the way of the universe, really.
So the house was built, and then you went on to other projects?
That's right, yes, the house was built. It looks beautiful, and it's actually a model that other people like to, architecturally speaking, it's a model that other people like to follow. So it's a lovely building, yeah. And then I talked to different groups about what I was doing, and I was running a permaculture course in Raglan, which is on the Wild West where all the surfies go on the coast of New Zealand. During the course I talked about the genuine wealth system, which is the savings pools system, and a group of them said, well, we ought to take this further. So after that course, there was a public meeting announced in the local hall, and we had, I think, about 10 or 15 people came along, and they decided, oh yeah, okay, let's go for it, and so they did. It was almost a year later I got a call saying, help, what do we do now? We've got ourselves a bank account, we've been accumulating money, but what do we do? So, I had to revisit them to what I'd spoken about, and set up the agreements for them. And
which are very simple agreements.
Yeah, very simple agreements.
That I have found.
Yeah,
very simple.
Yeah. And basically sort of they wanted to rewrite the agreements nevertheless, because the language they wanted to use was about borrowing and lending and paying it back and doing all sorts of things that actually, if you looked at it, started to move into the sphere of giving people credit, and so there's legislation about around all of that stuff.
Okay.
And if you don't get the concept right and language it correctly,
yes,
then you run the risk of falling into a minefield of legislation around money and how it's done.
But you have worked through all that. I know you have spent an enormous amount of time and checked it out with many, many people to get the wording right.
Yeah.
In these simple agreements.
Yep.
And that's the beauty of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So we got that right, and away they went. And very soon they reported, well, what happens now, the first person who wants to use what we've accumulated has got credit card debt and wants to retire the credit card debt, but we don't really know each other very well. What can we do? And so I said, well, it's all about not making loans but purchasing, and you can't purchase credit card debt. What does this woman suggest that she might like to purchase? And so she said, well, I've got a car that's valued at $4,000. I could sell that to our group and then enter into a purchase agreement to buy it back from the group. And so I'm just in a buying and selling mode, not a credit mode, and the group will own my car until I've paid it back, and I only want $1,000 and the car's worth $4,000, and so when I've met my obligations and paid that back, then I will resume ownership of the car and everyone's happy. And so that's what happened, and in fact that's now the model that Raglan Group has run with. That they've basically turned the system into like a pawn shop where they put up something that's of some value that people are comfortable with, and then away they go.
Great. So now there are like 17 of these groups around New Zealand putting their money together and making purchases at zero interest.
That's right.
And the money comes back, and then there's this pool of money that can be used for other people, for other projects.